Today I'd like to share with you from Matthew chapter 16, and I'd like to entitle today's message as the two big scandals. The two big scandals in the life of the Apostle Peter. Now, what is a scandal? Well, in today's world, if you talk about a scandal, you might be talking about some inappropriate action by some politicians, and so it becomes a big scandal. The core of the idea of scandal is something that breaks the support of, or the relationship of two parties. So if a politician previously had support, something happens, there's a big scandal, he's afraid that his supporters might disappear. People who vote for him might be reduced. Now this word, however, is translated in the Bible as stumbling block. Interestingly, the word stumbling block and the word scandal actually comes from the same Greek word, skandalidzo. A stumbling block is something that you trip over, something that trips you up. See, if you are walking along the road and there is an unexpected piece of stone there, you kick over it, you trip up and you fall. Or you might not fall, you stumble. But anything that trips you up is considered a stumbling block or considered something that scandalizes, from the original Greek word. Now, something that trips you up need not necessarily be bad. Something that trips you up might be your own fault. For example, if you are walking along a path and there is a curb, you are wandering off the path and you kick the curb. Well, the curb is not at fault. You shouldn't be going off and kicking the curb. So anything that trips you up, whether it should trip you up or not, is considered a stumbling block. And in some ways, this idea of whatever trips you up is reflected in the passage that we are going to look at today. Now, we have been looking at the life of Peter, the apostle, and we are looking at three aspects. The person, the man, we are looking at his ministry, and we're looking at his message. So we were looking at his message last week, and today we are going to toggle to the man, meaning what were Peter's experiences, the apostle Peter, and how did those experiences develop him along the way. Now, first of all, let's turn our attention to Matthew 16. Matthew 16, I'll read a few verses to you. It says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. 'Never, Lord,' he said, 'this shall never happen to you.' Jesus turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns.' Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.'" Now this is a rather unusual passage, a rather strange passage. What was happening here? Well, Jesus was explaining to his disciples the things that were to come about. Now today we look back at the events of Jesus dying on the cross and rising again the third day as events of the past and history and something quite expected. But it wasn't quite so expected during that time. They were expecting a king of some sort to come about. The Messiah basically means a king. To come about and to rule and to extend their national pride and victory. And then when Jesus explains that he is to suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, it just didn't sound right to Peter. Just didn't sound right that Jesus should be killed and on the third day be raised to life. In fact, the disciples in another passage were debating among themselves, what does it mean to die and to come back to life 3 days later? It must be some kind of a metaphor or some kind of a figurative speech or something like that, It's just not possible for a person to die and to come back to life. Now, whatever it was, it just didn't sound right. And so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. He started protesting loudly that this should not be. He said, "Lord, this shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned around and said to him, "You are a stumbling block." Now, this is the same word as we were talking about the word scandal. This is a scandal to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. In order to understand this, we go a little bit to the earlier passage where it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Son of Man meaning Jesus himself. They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "What do you say? Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." So here, there was this wonderful recognition by Peter. Peter realizes who Jesus really is, that you are the Messiah, the one chosen by God to deliver us, God's Savior for the world. And so Jesus had just praised Peter, voila, this is exactly right. And then, one moment later, he's calling Peter Satan. Satan, get behind me. So, what's happening here? What's happening in this situation? Well, Peter had many wrong ideas about who the Messiah was and what he ought to be. And so, Jesus had to forcefully correct him. But just in case you think that Peter was a bit out of place rebuking Jesus, why does the disciple have so much gumption, guts to be rebuking the master? Well, this is because the Jews understand the Messiah, when he comes, is going to be the king. Now, if you have watched any ancient Chinese serial movies or whatever, you'll know what the king is like. The king's word is absolute. Whatever he says is final. Nobody can argue or dispute it. And normally, he has his courtiers in front of him. His minister of finance or war or field marshal or prime minister or advisor or whatever. And when he speaks, hardly anybody dares to contradict. Everybody just keeps quiet because he's the king, right? But who speaks up? Their representative is usually the prime minister. The prime minister is the one who speaks up. He is the one who objects to the king. And in a certain sense, that was Peter's role. Peter's role was supposed to be the spokesman for all the disciples. And this is why many times you find Peter saying things, and there's a lot of conversation recorded by Peter. And sometimes people mistakenly say that because Peter was very vocal, well, it's partly true, or that he always says wrong things. Actually, what Peter says represents what everybody else is saying. Okay. He was the lead disciple and he was in that role. And so he is supposed to guard the interest of the king. So if you were to watch all these ancient Chinese shows, right? The king says something or has a plan. And that plan is not good. The plan is bad for the king or for the country. Then it is the duty of the prime minister to stand up and say, "Oh king, we respect you, we love you, but this is not right. You really mustn't do this." And that was Peter running and playing this role. Peter was saying, "Jesus, you cannot do this. You are a Messiah. Why do you say that you will suffer under these people? Why do you say that you'll be killed and then you'll be raised from the dead?" Well, so Peter was playing that role as the prime minister within the court of the king. And Jesus was that king who was supposed to make that final pronouncement or to put out that his laying out his plans for his disciples. In Peter's mind, this is a wimpy king. How can you be a king that loses out to all these people? I mean, just ask God to come down and judge all these folks and just wipe them out. Why are you behaving in such a timid way? You cannot be so timid as a king. This was Peter's big challenge. This was Peter's big scandal. Meaning that it is something that threatens Peter's relationship with Jesus. He says, "Jesus, I cannot accept this." And later in his letter, he explains what he was going through. He said this in 1 Peter chapter 2. Later, after Jesus died and rose from the dead and all that, he said this, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message." And Peter was recounting those days when Jesus was telling him that he is going to die and rise from the dead. And he says, this is something that causes people to stumble. This is a message that is so difficult for people to accept. How can you claim to be a king and yet be crucified? It's just impossible for us to reconcile that in our minds. So there were two stumbling blocks in the brief episode between Jesus and Peter. Peter is saying, Jesus, what you are saying is a stumbling block to me. I cannot take it. So you must not suffer. And Jesus says, Peter, what you are saying is a stumbling block to me because I must suffer. Okay. The path that I'm about to take is difficult enough without your discouraging me. So you must not discourage me. This is the path that I have to take. And this is why I call it two scandals. The two big scandals in the life of Peter. First, he was scandalized by what Jesus said, and Jesus was scandalized by what he said. Okay, all within one simple conversation. Now, and it is the same problem that, in fact, John the Baptist had with Jesus. You see, John the Baptist was the one who said, Jesus is the Messiah, he's the king, go follow him. And then John the Baptist got thrown into prison. And there he was languishing in prison, twiddling his thumbs, waiting for Jesus to rescue him, and Jesus didn't do anything. And then this was what he did. John was in prison. He heard about the deeds of the Messiah, and he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect somebody else? Jesus, I thought you're going to be the Messiah. I proclaim you as the Messiah, but I'm sitting here in prison, kind of rotting here. Aren't you going to help me out a little bit? Should I be looking for somebody else? That's what he's saying. Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Again, you see the same word, stumble. Meaning that there are some people who just cannot accept it. They insist on a geopolitical national leader among the Jews that they will now conquer throughout the yoke of Rome, conquer all the enemies around them. But Jesus said, I've not come to do this. These are your expectations of me, but they are not the right expectations. And I cannot live according to your expectations. I have a mission to accomplish. And so that can be a stumbling block to people.